The hidden heiress awakens. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the Morrison mansion, but the warmth it carried could not melt the chill that filled the air. Victoria Morrison stood barefoot in the kitchen, her trembling fingers tracing the edges of the papers that had just shattered her world. The coffee mug she dropped still lay broken on the floor, the spilled liquid forming dark rivers across the white marble, like her own heart bleeding silently. Her husband, James Morrison, a self-made millionaire in the tech world, had handed her divorce papers as casually as one would hand over a receipt. His words still echoed in her mind, cold, deliberate, and cruel. He had said he needed someone who understood his world, someone like Amber Dell'Oqua, the actress whose face now haunted Victoria's thoughts. For 5 years she had stood beside him through sleepless nights, late meetings, and endless sacrifices. She believed in his dreams when no one else did. She loved him when he had nothing. And now, 8 months pregnant, she was the one being left behind. Victoria pressed her hand against her belly, feeling the faint kick of the life growing inside her. It was both a comfort and a reminder. She was not alone. She would never be alone again. But as she looked at James's retreating figure walking toward the door, she realized that the man she thought she knew had become a stranger. There was no warmth left in his eyes, only ambition and greed. When the door closed behind him, the silence that followed felt deafening. The clock ticked somewhere in the distance, each sound marking the end of another illusion. Victoria sat down, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. She had once believed love was enough to build a life, but love had limits and James had reached his. Her phone lay on the counter, screen dark, waiting. She stared at it for a long time before picking it up. There was a number she had not dialed in 7 years, a number tied to a past she had buried. Her thumb hovered over the screen, her breath uneven. When she finally pressed the digits, the sound of the ringing tone filled the room. Sterling Steel Industries, came a voice, crisp and professional. This is Margaret Sterling's office. Victoria's heart skipped a beat. It's Victoria, she whispered. Victoria Sterling. The woman on the other end gasped softly. Miss Sterling, oh my goodness, it's been years. Please hold on. As the line went silent, memories flooded her mind. Childhood summers in the family estate, the smell of iron and oil from the steel mills, her grandmother's stern but loving voice telling her that the Sterling name carried responsibility. She had walked away from all of it, craving a simple life, wanting to be loved not for her family's wealth but for herself. And now, standing in the ruins of that decision, she realized that simplicity came with its own price. When her grandmother's voice finally came on the line, it carried the same authority that had once silenced boardrooms. Victoria Catherine Sterling, she said firmly. It's been 7 years. I know, Victoria replied softly, her throat tight. But I need your help, grandmother. It's time. There was a pause, one filled with unspoken emotions, regrets, and things that didn't need words. Then Margaret Sterling said the words that changed everything. I'll be on the next plane to Los Angeles. And Victoria, welcome home. Victoria set the phone down and exhaled shakily. For years she had hidden her true identity, refusing to use her family's wealth or power, choosing instead to be just Victoria Morrison. But now, as she felt her baby move again, she made a silent promise. She would protect her child. She would reclaim her strength. And James Morrison would soon learn the truth about the woman he had just discarded. Across town, Amber Dell'Oqua stood before her mirror, admiring her reflection. Her golden hair framed her face perfectly, and her smile gleamed with satisfaction. She had done it. She had captured James Morrison's heart, and soon his name. Hollywood had taught her that love was just another kind of transaction, and she had negotiated hers brilliantly. James arrived at her apartment, confident and charming, holding a designer bag filled with expensive gifts. He kissed her with the assurance of a man who believed he controlled his destiny. It's done, he said. Victoria knows. We can be together now. Amber's heart raced, not out of love but out of triumph. The actress had landed her biggest role yet, the wife of a millionaire. She couldn't wait to show the world what she had achieved. But as she looked into James's eyes, she noticed something cold and distant, something that whispered he wasn't the kind of man who truly loved anyone, not even her. Still, she pushed the thought aside. This was her chance to rise higher than ever before. She'd grown up poor, clawing her way through auditions and rejection. Now she was about to marry into luxury, into power. She told herself it was fate. Meanwhile, Victoria was sitting alone in her empty home, staring at the ultrasound photo in her hands. The heartbeat she'd heard earlier that day still echoed in her ears, a small, steady rhythm of life that gave her strength. She wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just a discarded wife. She was a Sterling. And when her grandmother's plane landed, the world that James Morrison thought he controlled would shift beneath his feet. That night, as Los Angeles lights shimmered outside her window, Victoria whispered softly to her unborn child, "We're going home." She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of her awakening, the moment when the hidden heiress would rise. The steel within, the private jet cut through the clouds like a silver blade, and inside, Margaret Sterling sat upright in her leather seat, her sharp eyes fixed on the skyline ahead. At 62, she had seen empires rise and fall, fortunes gained and lost. But what awaited her in Los Angeles was personal. Her granddaughter had been humiliated, and in the Sterling family, humiliation was never left unanswered. By the time Margaret's car pulled up to Victoria's Beverly Hills home, the place looked more like a museum than a home, cold, perfect, and empty. Victoria greeted her grandmother at the door, her face pale but steady. The moment they looked at each other, years of silence dissolved. Margaret took one look at her granddaughter's swollen belly, then at the shadows under her eyes, and her heart softened. "You've been through hell," she said simply, pulling Victoria into a rare embrace. Victoria nodded, her voice trembling. "I thought I was building a life with him, but he only saw what he could take." Margaret's gaze hardened, her business instincts sparking to life. "Then it's time to take it back and end more. He's underestimated you, my dear, and that's the kind of mistake men like James Morrison don't survive." Later that evening, the two women sat in the dim light of the living room. Margaret spread a folder across the table, documents, stock reports, and business summaries bearing the name Morrison Innovations. "We own 41% of his company," Margaret said, her voice calm, almost casual. Victoria blinked in disbelief. "You what?" "For the last 2 years, I've been buying his company through subsidiaries. I had a feeling this man would try to hurt you one day. Now it's time to make him regret it." Victoria stared at the documents, her heart pounding. She had run from this world, the one filled with power plays, strategy, and silent wars. But now, sitting across from her grandmother, something inside her shifted. It wasn't fear anymore. It was resolve. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Margaret smiled, her eyes gleaming like polished steel. "You're going to walk back into his world, but not as the woman he left. You'll walk in as Victoria Sterling, the rightful heir to the Sterling steel dynasty. You won't need to raise your voice. Your name will do all the talking." That night, Victoria lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house felt strange. Once a symbol of love, now a battlefield. She thought of James, of his arrogance, his coldness. She thought of Amber, the woman who had replaced her, wearing her husband's love like a stolen crown. And she thought of her unborn child, innocent, unaware of the storm that had been unleashed. As dawn broke, she rose, showered, and dressed carefully. Gone was the soft, uncertain woman who had cried over broken promises. In her place stood someone new, someone her grandmother would have been proud of. She tied her auburn hair back, looked in the mirror, and whispered to her reflection, "No more hiding." Meanwhile, James Morrison was having the best morning of his life. He was sitting across from investors at the rooftop restaurant of the Chateau Marmont, charm radiating from every gesture. Amber sat beside him, glowing with pride, the perfect accessory to his success. "I've made some tough personal choices," James said smoothly, "but they've allowed me to focus entirely on the next phase of Morrison Innovations." His investors nodded approvingly, their eyes gleaming with dollar signs. No one questioned his decisions, and not his divorce, not the rumors, not the ethics. In the world James lived in, winning was all that mattered. But just as he was about to toast his future, his phone buzzed. A single notification flashed across the screen. "Stockholder control update, Morrison Innovations Board emergency meeting, initiated by Sterling Holdings." He froze, his hand tightening around the glass. "That can't be right," he muttered. Amber frowned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," he lied, though his mind was spinning. Sterling Holdings? Why does that name sound familiar? He excused himself and made a call to his lawyer. Within minutes, his confidence began to crumble. James, his lawyer said cautiously, Sterling Holdings just revealed their ownership structure. They control over 40% of your company's shares. They've called an emergency meeting to review your leadership position. James felt the blood drain from his face. That's impossible. Who the hell are they? There was a pause. James, Sterling Holdings is a subsidiary of Sterling Steel Industries. The chairwoman is Margaret Sterling. The name hit him like a thunderclap. He remembered it, faintly. Victoria's maiden name, Sterling. The heiress he'd once mocked for being too traditional. The family she'd claimed she wanted nothing to do with. Find out everything you can, he snapped, his voice sharp with panic. Amber reached for his arm, concerned. James, what's going on? He didn't answer, because in that moment, he realized the woman he'd left wasn't a nobody. She was the storm he had just invited into his life. Back in Pittsburgh, the Sterling Estate's grand conference room glowed with soft morning light. Victoria stood beside her grandmother as executives filled the table. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her family's legacy settle comfortably on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman who had ever been underestimated, dismissed, or discarded. Margaret placed a hand on her shoulder. Remember, darling, she said quietly, the best revenge isn't destruction. It's power. And you already have it. Victoria nodded, her voice steady. Then it's time to use it. She picked up the pen before her, signing the order that would call for the emergency board meeting at Morrison Innovations. Her signature wasn't shaky or uncertain. It was bold, like the woman she was becoming. Across the city, James Morrison's empire began to tremble. Stockholders whispered. Lawyers scrambled. The media caught wind of a corporate shakeup led by none other than the Sterling heiress. And as Victoria watched the first headlines appear on her phone, pregnant ex-wife of tech millionaire revealed as hidden heiress to billion-dollar steel empire. She allowed herself the faintest smile. The war had begun. The city woke under a pale sky while Victoria sat on the edge of the guest bed at the Sterling estate. One hand pressed to the soft rhythm inside her belly, the other wrapped around a warm mug she had not yet sipped. She listened to the old house breathe, the faint hum of vents, a distant creak of wood settling, the whisper of rain against tall windows, and realized she was finally hearing her own thoughts again. Not James's opinions, not the shallow noise of parties and performative dinners, just her breath and her child's. She thought about the little promises she had made in the darkest nights, promises to be gentle with herself when life was not gentle, to forgive herself for believing a man who did not know how to love, to become the kind of mother who teaches her child that courage is not the absence of fear, but the steady choice to do what is right anyway. And as she held that mug, she began to believe that these promises were not fairy tales but a plan, a map home to herself, the person she had abandoned when she changed her last name and moved to Los Angeles to become smaller so that he could look bigger. She would not be smaller again. Not for him, not for anyone, Doctor. Elizabeth Chen arrived just after 9, brisk and kind. She examined Victoria with practiced hands, listened to the baby's heartbeat, and then did something Victoria didn't know she needed. She asked how her heart was doing, not the organ, but the part that hurts when people break their word. Victoria answered honestly. She spoke about betrayal without dramatics, about anger without venom, about fear without shame. Dr. Chen nodded, then taught her a breathing pattern that anchored the mind and warmed the belly, a way to invite calm when panic tried to take the steering wheel. They practiced together until the rhythm felt familiar, and when they finished, Margaret stood in the doorway with an expression that was half pride, half relief, as if she had been waiting years to witness this exact moment, the moment her granddaughter chose herself with clear eyes later. Margaret led Victoria to the conservatory where sunlight spilled across ferns and the faint scent of damp earth softened the air. The table was already set with papers, but Margaret did not push them forward. Instead, she told a story about the year she took the company after Thomas died, how the board doubted her, how the union stewards distrusted a woman in a tailored suit, how the banks almost smiled her into failure. She described the night she sat alone with a ledger and a thermos of coffee, and decided that fear would not make a single decision for her ever again. She did not tell the story to impress Victoria, but to offer her a lantern for the road ahead, to say here is the proof you come from women who endure and build. And when the story ended, She slid a single sheet across the table, the agenda for the emergency board meeting at Morrison Innovations. Victoria read it slowly, then spoke in a voice that surprised even herself. Calm, measured, steady. She said she wanted the meeting not to humiliate James but to protect the employees and the shareholders and the child who would one day ask who she had been when it mattered. That afternoon, Victoria wrote a letter she had avoided writing. It was to herself at 22, the girl who left Pittsburgh angry and hopeful. She apologized for forgetting her own worth. She forgave herself for choosing a man who looked like a future but acted like a sale, and she thanked that younger self for leaving breadcrumbs back to this house. Old photo albums tucked in a box, the phone number memorized, the part of her spine that never quite bent. She folded the letter and slipped it into a book on the nursery shelf the staff had begun to prepare, a small act that said memory can be a teacher, not a trap. Then she called Dr. Williams in Los Angeles to thank her for kindness during the haze of shock and to say that she would be transferring care to Pittsburgh. The doctor's voice softened with genuine warmth. She told Victoria that babies felt their mothers steadying, that peace was a gift passed through blood and breath, and Victoria pressed her palm to her belly and whispered, "Do you feel that, little one? We're learning peace." News outlets circled the Morrison story with the hunger of markets. Headlines shouted about a hidden heiress and a corporate ambush. The internet did what the internet does, built myths, picked sides, sharpened opinions like knives, and in the noise, Victoria found a center by choosing her actions instead of reacting to theirs. She approved a statement that was short and clear. It said that continuity of leadership would be discussed by the board in light of fiduciary responsibilities and recent disclosures. It did not call names, it did not spit fire. It sounded like a woman who understood that power whispers when spectacle screams. Even so, James read the statement as if it were a public slap. He paced suites and called lawyers and shouted at men who could not fix the past 3 years of his decisions with a memo. He told himself he was the victim of an ambush. But the mirror did not confirm his story. Not when it reflected the man who had delivered divorce papers to a pregnant wife and thought it was efficiency. Amber watched him unravel with a kind of quiet dread. She had believed she was stepping into a life of security and status, yet she was now seeing the fine crack in the diamond, the line where charm ended and control began. One evening she arrived at the penthouse with a small bag of groceries and found him railing at a silent phone. She set the bag down and, almost without thinking, began to make soup simple and warm. The smell changed the room before the words did. She told him softly that he should eat, that nothing good was ever decided on an empty stomach. He stared at the bowl and then at her, confused by a kindness that asked for nothing. For a second his face looked younger, then the mask returned. He asked if she would stand beside him at the meeting. She hesitated, not because she loved him less, but because something in her knew that a person should not be a prop at the exact moment another person must face himself. She said she would be nearby. He heard it as a betrayal, but it was the first honest thing either of them had said in weeks. On the evening before the meeting, Victoria walked the long corridor of family portraits and paused before the painting of Thomas at the furnace. His jaw set, his sleeves rolled. A man bound to heat and gravity. She realized that her fight was not against James alone. It was against the idea that love requires shrinking, that partnership is barter, that a woman must choose between tenderness and strength. She placed her hand on the cool frame and, without meaning to, spoke aloud to her grandfather. She said that she had been afraid of becoming hard, afraid that power would turn her into stone, and then she laughed softly because the answer had been in front of her the whole time. Steel is not stone. Steel is forged. It bends before it breaks. It learns from heat how to hold. She did not need to become cold to become strong. She could set boundaries and still keep her heart. She could protect her child and still bless the world that had hurt her. She drafted a proposal for the board that night. Not a humiliation, but a transition. It recommended an interim CEO with operational depth, oversight committees to restore confidence, a review of related party transactions, and a plan for equitable severance that included protections for rank-and-file employees. She asked legal to include a clause offering James a path to a dignified departure conditioned on accountability, and a non-interference agreement. It was firm and fair and very unlike the cinematic revenge fantasies strangers online hoped she would enact. When she finished, she closed her laptop and wrote one more thing by hand, a note addressed to James. It said simply that she would not fight him in tabloid headlines, that their child would someday read all of this, and that she hoped the person he chose to be in those pages would be one he could defend to a 10-year-old with clear eyes. She did not know if he would understand, but the act of writing it unclenched something in her chest. Morning came silver and quiet. Cars lined the circular drive, and the conference room at Morrison Innovations filled with a tension that hummed like wires in a storm. Victoria entered not as an accessory but as a principal. The room changed temperature when people realized who she was and why she was there. James looked at her and for a breath forgot the scripts he had rehearsed with counsel. He saw the woman who had made him soup during a flu, and the woman who had sat through launch nights, and the woman who had asked for so little that he had mistaken her kindness for emptiness. In that breath he felt grief for the first time, not at losing control, but at losing the chance to be the man he once told himself he would become. Then the breath passed and the meeting began. She spoke with the measured patience of someone who understood that impatience is expensive. She outlined the plan, named the risks, named the remedies, named the duty that everyone in the room shared regardless of personal history. She did not look at James when she did not need to, and when she did look at him it was without hatred, which somehow hurt him more. Board members asked hard questions and she answered them, and when she did not know, she said so and passed the question to the expert beside her. The vote was scheduled for the afternoon. The room emptied in waves, and when they were finally alone, James asked her why she had not tried to ruin him. She stood very still and said, "Because our child deserves a father who was given the chance to do the right thing, even if he didn't take it." When Victoria stepped back into the hallway, Margaret was waiting. The older woman searched her granddaughter's face for the cost and found it, but she also found something brighter, a kind of quiet gained only by walking through fire and choosing not to let it char the soul. They did not hug, not there beneath the eyes of men who traded in stories, but Margaret reached out and adjusted a small fold of fabric at Victoria's shoulder, a gesture so gentle it was almost a benediction. Outside, the sky was clearing, the storm drifting east, and Victoria felt the baby roll, an impatient little tumble that made her laugh. She pressed her palm to the movement and whispered that they were almost through this part, that the next one would be softer, that home was not just a place with a name above a gate, but a life built on truths that could stand. And in that hallway, she realized the truest thing of all. Her story was no longer about proving anyone wrong. It was about becoming the person her child could trust. And that was the kind of victory no vote could give and no headline could take. If you'd like me to deliver the final chapter next, I'll craft the ending that satisfies the heart and ties every thread. Justice, dignity, co-parenting boundaries, the board's vote, Amber's choice, and the birth scene that lands with hope and closure. The return of grace. The vote ended just after noon, sunlight falling through the tall windows of the boardroom in thin, golden bars, the kind that make even tense rooms look peaceful. Victoria sat still as the final count came in. She didn't need to see the raised hands to know what it meant. The motion passed. James Morrison would step down as CEO of Morrison Innovations effective immediately. The company would be placed under a new interim leadership team, jointly selected by the board and Sterling Steel Industries. Murmurs filled the air, papers shuffled, chairs moved, but Victoria heard none of it. She was listening instead to the quiet inside herself, the one that said, "You did it without hate." James looked at her across the long table, his posture smaller now, his eyes carrying the weight of something that looked like truth for the first time in years. "You didn't destroy me," he said quietly, as if still trying to understand it. "Why?" She met his gaze without anger. "Because I was never trying to destroy you. James, I was trying to protect what mattered. Our child, our future, my peace, the company, all of it. There was enough fire in the world already. I didn't need to add more." For a long moment he said nothing, then he nodded once, a slow, almost humble motion. "I was cruel, I know it," he admitted. "I thought power meant winning every argument. I didn't realize it just means knowing which ones are worth fighting." Victoria gave a faint, tired smile, then learned from it, she said simply. And when she rose to leave, she felt no triumph, only release outside. Margaret waited with quiet pride, her eyes shining like polished glass. "You carried yourself like a sterling today," she said, "and like a woman who knows the difference between revenge and justice." Victoria took her grandmother's hand. "Maybe it's both," she whispered. "But it feels like freedom." They left the building as reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed, the world already spinning its stories. But Victoria walked through it as though the noise belonged to another universe. She had her own to build now, a smaller, kinder one. Days later, in the hushed comfort of her Pittsburgh home, Victoria gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The delivery was long but steady. Margaret stood outside the room whispering prayers she hadn't said in years. When the doctor placed the baby in Victoria's arms, the weight of him made everything real. Soft. Warm. Breathing. Hers. She traced the tiny curve of his cheek and said, "Welcome to the world, my little miracle." She named him Thomas, after the man whose portrait watched over the family's steel empire, but also after the legacy she hoped to rebuild, not of cold metal, but of strength that bends without breaking. The news of the birth spread quickly, and with it came messages from every corner. Board members offering congratulations, employees sending flowers, even Amber Delocqua, who had quietly ended her relationship with James and moved out of Los Angeles, sent a handwritten note that said simply, "Congratulations. I hope he grows up in a world kinder than the one we built around ourselves." When Victoria read that, she didn't feel bitterness, only understanding. Everyone had been chasing something. James his ambition, Amber her belonging, and she herself her worth. But life had a way of teaching that peace was never found in someone else's shadow. In the weeks that followed, the Sterling estate came alive again, laughter replacing echo, baby cries weaving through corridors once filled only with silence. Victoria returned to work slowly, joining strategy meetings from home, balancing board reports with bottle feedings. She no longer hid from responsibility or her lineage. Instead, she used it, shaping the company's new division that invested in sustainable steel production and community rebuilding projects. Work that turned power into service. Sometimes, when she walked through the gardens at sunset, she thought of the woman she had been a year ago. Quiet, uncertain, small inside someone else's world. And she would smile at the thought of how much light a single choice can let in. The choice to stand up, to call home, to remember your own name. James sent a message one evening, months after the meeting. It arrived without warning. "Thank you for not ruining me. I'm trying to build something honest now. I hope one day Thomas will know me for that." She read it twice, then replied, "Then build it and be that man. Nothing more, no bitterness, no reopening of wounds. Just a line of peace stretching between two people who had finally stopped hurting each other." As autumn came, the estate's old trees turned gold. Victoria stood on the terrace with her son asleep against her chest. Margaret sat nearby, reading financial pages through half-moon glasses. The air smelled of rain and clean beginnings. "You did well, child," her grandmother said, not looking up from the paper. "You turned pain into purpose," Victoria smiled. "Maybe that's what we're all supposed to do," she murmured. And the baby stirred softly, his small hand gripping her finger with surprising strength. She looked out at the horizon, steel gray and endless, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not power, not revenge, but grace. Pure and quiet, the kind that stays because in the end, stories like hers weren't about wealth or dynasty. They were about rediscovering the courage to begin again, to rebuild from ashes, to forgive without forgetting. She had lost a marriage but found herself, lost illusion but gained truth, and that was worth more than any fortune. When the wind moved through the trees, she whispered to her son, "We're home now." And for the first time since the coffee mug had shattered across the floor of that Beverly Hills kitchen, she truly believed it.